Hello and welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick, and today for our first episode, we're going to be talking about Margaret Atwood's exceptional collection of poetry, The Journals of Susannah Moody. Now, some of you may be wondering why I'm starting a podcast about Canada's literary and cultural history with a book initially published in 1970. And no, I'm not just aping off of the attention that Atwood is getting with the release of her sequel to The Handmaid's Tale in a desperate hope to boost my fledgling project. Well, alright, maybe there's a bit of truth to that, but there's a valid reason for it as well. The Journals of Susannah Moody is a useful text to start with, not only because it is written by one of Canada's best-known authors, but also because it hits on so many themes that will become crucial to the yarn of history that we are weaving. Because of the multiple subjects, this is not going to be a very precise or even concise episode. What I want to do for this first episode is introduce some of the key concepts and aspects of Canadian history and culture, but also how these concepts still relate to this very day. Now, this book is a collection of poems in which Margaret Atwood adopts the voice of Susannah Moody, who was a British settler who did actually exist and arrived in Canada in 1832. She and her family established themselves in Upper Canada in what is today known as Ontario. The real-life Moody did write about Canada and the life of a settler in a country that was still very underdeveloped for the time, let alone by contemporary standards. Her books, Roughing It in the Bush and Life in the Clearings, are what Atwood used to base her poems on. To give you an idea of the type of narrative we're dealing with here, I'm going to read the first poem of the collection. This should give you an idea of the voice that is used throughout the collection and the subjects that are touched upon. This first poem is called Disembarking at Quebec. Is it my clothes, my way of walking, the things I carry in my hand, a book, a bag with knitting, the incongruous pink of my shawl, this space cannot hear? Or is it my own lack of conviction which makes these vistas of desolation, long hills, the swamps, the barren sand, the glare of sun on the bone-white drift logs, omens of winter, the moon alien in day, time a thin refusal, the others leap, shout, freedom! The moving water will not show me my reflection. The rocks ignore. I am a word in a foreign language. But why use Atwood's essentially derivative text? Why not go directly to the source? Well, the best explanation for that comes from Margaret Atwood herself in the afterword to her text when she says, "When I did read her books, I was disappointed. The prose was discursive and ornamental, and the books had little shape. They were collections of disconnected anecdotes. The only thing that held them together was the personality of Miss Moody and the way in which it reflects many of the obsessions still with us." Well, there you have it, folks. Atwood's version is just more enjoyable to read. And I'm not just taking the author's word for it here either. I read parts of Roughing It in the Bush, and, well, let's just say that the full book would have been a bit much to get through. The Journals of Susannah Moody are a condensing of a particular character through which to explore the anxieties of Canada's past and present. We can't cover all of them, but let's go over some of them just to give us a sense of the themes that are to come throughout this series. The most obvious point that stands out to many people is the fact that Moody is a settler. She is coming from the heart of the British Empire into the colony that Canada was still at the time. Despite all the bad that it brought, namely for Native American populations in Canada, it cannot be denied that settler colonialism had a massive impact on shaping Canada into what it is today. Our politics, society, and culture are all very much influenced or directly pulled from ideas that were brought from European settler societies and that mixed with Indigenous ideas. Of course, the impact of colonialism on the First Nations and Inuit people is a subject that is hard but necessary to acknowledge. I won't be going into much detail here about the interactions between Europeans and the Indigenous people of Canada, because it is not a specific subject in Atwood's book. That'll be a discussion for another time when we get to texts that relate to this subject much more directly, but it is one that I had to mention in the settler discussion. Now, the settler aspect of the journals of Susannah Moody can be explored more thoroughly in this episode in how it plays out in the modern world, specifically in our approach to immigration. In the story's 19th century setting, the approach to new arrivals in the Canadian colony was one of assimilation. People lived here or who came to the territory from afar, whether they were European settlers or Native Americans, were expected to adapt to the British way of life that was becoming the groundwork for this new nation. This would remain true even after Confederation in 1867, when Canada basically became an independent country. This is what happens to Susannah Moody. She is an outsider, even if she is British, and she evolves to adapt to Canada. This doesn't mean that immigrants lost all aspects of their culture at this time. Far from it. There is a great book by John Murray Gibbon about that specific subject, actually, called Canadian Mosaic, The Making of a Northern Nation, in which he explains the extent to which European immigrants kept a great part of their heritage while integrating into the Canadian model. The idea was literally to make a cohesive unit out of many, a mosaic, if you will. In a world in which Atwood writes, during the 60s and 70s, the approach becomes less assimilationist. More and more immigrants were being encouraged to maintain greater parts of their heritage and traditions and superimpose them onto Canadian life instead of fusing into it. My point here is to explain that Canada's culture is still very much defined by its relation to immigration and population mixing. The approach has shifted over time, but the end goal is the same. That Canada is less of a melting pot like in the United States and more of a puzzle. The major question for Atwood's interpretation of Susannah Moody as a settler is the question of identity and survival, the latter being a theme that returns often in Margaret Atwood's work concerning Canada. In fact, the author has pointed to the concept of survival, in its physical and mental sense, as the significant driving force behind the forging of a Canadian culture and identity, namely in her work, Survival. For a great part of the work, Moody does not feel at home and downright hates being away from Britain. The cold, the struggle to live in an unforgiving territory, and the people are all things that the voice of the poems despises. Yet she stays and makes the best of what she sees as a bad situation. This struggle for survival comes to embody her and forges her identity. Moody becomes a proud Canadian after having grasped at her British past. She chooses to be Canadian so as to have these settler hardships mean something. If she hadn't become Canadian after surviving all of that, then what was the point? I'll quote from one of the poems, this one called The Double Voice, to show where Moody ends up. Keep in mind the first text that was read and the bitterness that was felt in it. Two voices took turns using my eyes. One had manners, painted in watercolors, used hushed tones when speaking of mountains or Niagara Falls, composed uplifting verse and expended sentiment upon the poor. The other voice had other knowledge, that men sweat always and drink often, that pigs are pigs and must be eaten anyway, that unborn babies fester like wounds in the body, that there is nothing to be done about mosquitoes. One saw through my bleared and gradually bleaching eyes, red leaves, the rituals of seasons and rivers. The other found a dead dog, jubilant with maggots, half buried among the sweet peas. In this poem, the duality of holding on to the typically British sentiments that Moody had grown up with is very contrasted with almost the stereotypical niceness and ruggedness of the Canadian. In The Double Voice, Moody finally strikes a balance between the two, and I think that's why it's particularly important to highlight this one. and that it really indicates what I was meaning in terms of Canadian mosaic. I want to cap this whole discussion off with a little section on what this collection of poems means for the modern world and what it meant for the context of the time that it was written in. When Atwood was writing from the 20th century, and even when reading this book in the 21st, when this comes out, it's 2019, right, almost 50 years after the book initially came out, these ideas still ring true, albeit slightly differently. Susannah Moody's survival is, as mentioned before, both a physical and mental struggle. She needs to live and redefine herself to this new land. In a more modern context, the physical aspect for most Canadians went by the wayside. After all, it is only a minimal percentage of the people that now live in the so-called bush that Susannah Moody sees as a defining aspect of Canada's landscape. Most people live in big industrialized cities. And that's exactly the point. The struggle for survival in Canada, while it waned on the bodily aspect, skyrocketed on the cultural and identitarian side. American culture is something that Susannah Moody encounters that represents, in the context of the poems, Canada's historic struggle to find a voice while being stuck between two empires, the British and the American one. This struggle is not played up for the greater part of the collection. If anything, it is a shadow looming in the background, acknowledged every once in a while. It is nevertheless indicative of the type of anxiety that will come to get a lot of play as Canada comes into its own. This is especially true in the ending of the book, in the epilogue of sorts, when Atwood has an ethereal Susannah Moody look upon modern Toronto from the great beyond. The megalithic American industry and culture comes to the forefront. So this last poem that I'm going to be reading is called A Bus Along St. Clair, December, and it's told from the point of view, as I just said, of a dead Susannah Moody, coming back in what was then modern Toronto. Keep in mind the idea of American industrialism, this idea of technological progress, covering up the past. It would take more than that to banish me. This is my kingdom still. Turn, look up. Through the gritty window, an unexplored wilderness of wires. Though they buried me in monuments of concrete slabs, of cables, though they mounded a pyramid of cold light over my head, though they said, we will build silver paradise with a bulldozer. It shows how little they know about vanishing. I have my ways of getting through. Right now, the snow is no more familiar to you than it was to me. This is my doing. The gray air, the roar going on behind it, are no more familiar. I am the old woman sitting across from you on the bus, her shoulders drawn up like a shawl. Out of her eyes come secret hatpins, destroying the walls, the ceiling. Turn, look down. There is no city. This is the center of a forest. Your place is empty. Survival now means remaining yourself in the American empire. The choice is no longer between one or another. It is making the best of a bad situation in a new type of wilderness, the hyper-industrialized modern world. Later 20th century Canadians, as Atwood was at the time, and still is, she's still alive, were thinking a great deal about this, and it is reflected in their writing, as we will most likely later see. Once again, we'll turn to a quote by Margaret Atwood to help explain just what I mean by this. This is from the afterword of her collection, and it reads, "If the national mental illness of the United States is megalomania, that of Canada is paranoid schizophrenia. Mrs. Moody is divided down the middle. She praises the Canadian landscape, but accuses it of destroying her. She dislikes the people already in Canada, but finds in people her only refuge from the land itself. She preaches progress and the march of civilization while brooding elegically upon the destruction of the wilderness. She claims to be an ardent Canadian patriot, while all the time she is standing back from the country and criticizing it as though she were a detached observer, a stranger. Perhaps that is the way we still live. We are all immigrants to this place, even if we were born here. The country is too big for anyone to inhabit completely, and the parts unknown to us we move in fear, exiles, and invaders. This country is something that must be chosen. It is so easy to leave, and if we do choose it, we are still choosing a violent duality. Okay, I think that's actually a good place to stop. It is short indeed, but so is the book. As I stated at the start of this episode, I think this is a great place to start and to introduce the show because it opens up onto so many avenues that are integral to understanding Canadian literature, identity, and history, from settler mentality to Canada's place on the world stage, and of course, what it means to be Canadian. Margaret Atwood's The Journals of Susannah Moody is a fantastic read that offers insights into early Canadian life as well as the modern one. It is, for all intents and purposes, a timeless book. I highly recommend it actually as an introductory read to Canadian literature, Canadian culture. It's a small and very approachable book that hits hard on so many levels. With that being said, I just want to thank you all for listening, and if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or suggestions for the future, you can always email them to me at historiacanadiana@gmail.com. Cheers, everyone.